Thank you for joining the McLean County Chamber of Commerce for our member education presentation on the graduated tax. I'm Jancy LaFollette with the Chamber of Commerce, and I'll be kicking off our presentation today. We want to thank our member education series sponsor, Reiser, Chinsky & Company, LLC, which allows our member education presentations to be free to attend for our chamber members. So we want to give a big shout out to our sponsor. Today's session will be recorded and will be available for viewing in the next few weeks. The link will be provided through our chamber website at www.mcleancochamber.org. Currently, all of your lines are muted, and we encourage you to ask questions in the chat box on the Zoom platform. So utilize that chat functionality for questions as we move throughout our presentation today. Today's presentation is timely, as Illinois voters will be making a decision on November 3rd regarding the state's constitutionally mandated flat income tax or changing the Constitution to allow for a graduated tax rate. Today's graduated tax presentation is presented by Dr. Orphe Divounguy. I totally butchered that. I told you I would.
That's okay.
He is the Chief Economics Officer at the Illinois Policy Institute. So earlier today, I sent all of you a fact sheet from the Illinois Policy Institute, and you can find that also attached in the chat box if you guys didn't get that email. So this presentation is from original research that the Illinois Policy Institute has done, led by Orphe. And so I'm going to turn it over to you and have you introduce yourself and give an overview and get us started. So Orphe, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, first of all, for having me this morning. I'm extremely excited to be here and to kind of talk about the work we've done. So without further ado, I'm going to go into this and kind of tell you what's coming up with this vote in November. You know, I'll start with, I don't know how many of you have a 4-year-old at home. You know, I have 2 toddlers at home, a 4-year-old named Pierre, and then my daughter is 2.5, Marie-Violette. And, you know, with kids all the time, you know, you ask them to do certain things and sometimes they just, you know, they'll throw a tantrum. And so what I do with my kids is I teach them to keep their promises, right? So if daddy can keep his promises, then they should too. But for some of us, right, we're old enough to remember this, and I'm not because I'm a little bit younger. But in 1953, the Illinois General Assembly created the Illinois State Toll Highway Commission, and the goal of the Highway Commission was to borrow money so it could build highways. Then Governor Bill Stratton promised the public and legislators in Springfield that tolls would be temporary, right? And that, you know, we would build a highway, you'd pay tolls to pay off the debt that was incurred to build the highway, and that these tolls would be temporary. Today, I don't know how many of you actually, how often you drive into Chicago, to the Chicago area, but these tolls are really annoying, right? So you're sitting there, you stop at every toll, and you're paying, you know, it's $160, $360, right? And so it adds up. And for low-income families, that could be a problem, right? Going in and out, you know, to work every morning. But on top of that, right? So what the governor had said at the time was that, you know, we thought we'd be able to pay this off, and once we paid it off, it will go away, right? And Pat Quinn in 2011 later said, it was important to keep those tolls around to prevent having to raise the gas tax. Today, we have both the gas tax and the tolls, right? So we're paying more to government, no matter what. And it's really difficult, I think, for most low-income families to keep having to deal with these tax and fee increases every year. And so if we expect our 4-year-olds to behave and keep their promises, I'm curious as to why we don't expect lawmakers and our elected officials to keep theirs. And so that I kind of want to leave that with you, that little story with you before I go into this presentation, which is basically entitled, "Can Springfield be trusted with new taxing powers?" Can we actually trust the lawmakers to keep their promises when they have time and time again failed to do so? So I'm going to kind of briefly give you an overview of the Illinois economy even before COVID-19. So, you know, we had a run up. We had a 10-year economic expansion that started at the end of the Great Recession. And we got to 2019. So, you know, Governor Pritzker was elected. We had some budget issues. Governor Pritzker was elected, and he made a lot of promises. One of the promises he made was, you know, he's going to raise taxes. And he started from day one with, you know, the first budget. There were 20 new tax and fee hikes implemented that were passed with his budget. And in 2019, of course, when we look at the economy, even before COVID-19, the Illinois economy was not doing really well. And you, the business community, would be very familiar with that. You know, we had the least tax-friendly climate in the country. We had the largest population loss in the nation during the last decade, and it actually accelerated in the last 4 years. Personal income growth was 49th in the country out of 50 states, right? So incomes are not growing fast enough. We're not growing fast enough in the state of Illinois relative to other states for other Americans. Private employment actually declined, right? So, you know, back in January, the governor came out and said, you know, we had a great first year. Actually, what happened is they had the worst first year of any governor since Blagojevich. They actually, the state actually lost jobs in 2019. And we had the second highest percentage of underwater homes in the country, right? So people owe more on their mortgages than their homes are worth in Illinois. Worst in the Midwest. Fourth highest mortgage delinquency rate in the Midwest, and the second lowest housing appreciation in the country. And I'm telling you all this because these things matter. Policy matters for people's lives, and if we can create the right policy environment, then people will thrive. And so going even before COVID, having all of these troubles, right, leading up to COVID, was a bad omen, is a bad sign, and what it tells us as business leaders and economists is that something needs to change, right? Something has to be done. The Bloomington metropolitan area actually lost jobs in 2019, right? Lost 500 private sector jobs in 2019. And so things are not looking good in Illinois. They were not looking good in Illinois before COVID-19, and COVID-19 only exacerbated things, right? So in the first quarter of 2020, Illinois' economy actually declined. We saw that across the country. We had a huge decline in economic activity due to COVID-19 and the restrictions imposed on businesses and private citizens. 1.3 million Illinoisans lost their jobs. Delinquency rates nearly doubled to almost levels that we observed during the housing crisis, which was really the worst recession since the Great Depression back in 08, 09. And so again, COVID really exacerbated a terrible situation. And it leaves economists and policymakers thinking, well, what is the right policy prescription? How do we fix things? When things are broken, we should be trying to fix them. When Illinoisans are hurting, we should be trying to help them. And that ought to be the focus. But unfortunately, the focus we're seeing now has completely shifted from trying to help struggling Illinoisans to implemented higher and higher taxes in order to fill budget holes, budget shortfalls, and we're seeing that again this year. But this is not new, right? So we saw that also during the Great Depression, the Great Recession, where state and local governments were actually trying to we were getting a lot of fiscal stimulus from the federal government, but state and local governments were actually trying to balance their budgets by raising taxes and raising fees and on citizens, which of course will undo any of the positive effects of federal fiscal stimulus will have. And so what we've been urging the state government at Illinois Policy is, don't repeat mistakes. Don't make the same mistakes that you've made in the past, right? Because so many lives are at stake, so many families are enduring economic hardship at this time. So what are some typical policy prescriptions for recovery? Do not raise taxes, right? Higher taxes reduce disposable income, right? And that's the disposable income is our ability to spend, to save and invest, to build a future, to plan ahead for our futures. And unfortunately, they're doing the opposite, right? Spend with purpose. Use your rainy day funds, use federal funds to prevent mass business failures and help households in tough times, during economic tough times. And again, unfortunately, Illinois is unable to do that, right? So because during the good times, we've accumulated so much debt and unpaid bills to businesses that we've had no rainy day fund to speak of before entering this horrible economic crisis. Another good policy is support hiring, right? How do we support hiring? Well, we need to hold a cost for government workers. Where we need to keep. We cannot engage in a policy of raising wages for public sector workers when so many people are losing their jobs, because what it does ultimately is it raises labor costs for taxpayers, for private sector businesses. It raises labor costs for private sector businesses, and they're unable to keep up with the wage increases that the government is putting together for public sector workers. I think that's something that's very often overlooked, and that there's a connection between how much public sector workers earn in the public sector and private sector workers. If the public sector is consistently pushing wages up, then private sector businesses will have a hard time. Businesses will have a hard time keeping up with this competition, right, from the public sector and attracting the most qualified workers. And so every time there's an increase in public sector salaries, labor costs for the private sector also increase. So this is something that the Illinois government, is failing to recognize. They actually implemented raises for private sector workers back in June. Lawmakers were also due to get a raise, and so we're in the middle of hard fiscal times. 1.3 million people lost their jobs. We should be trying to support hiring, not make hiring more difficult for businesses. So what's in the progressive tax proposal? We've all seen the ads, right? They're everywhere in Illinois. In fact, I heard, it was kind of funny, I heard that some ads were actually being played in Texas because our governor is spending a lot of money and they're not very careful about where they're advertising this proposal. They call it the fair tax. And what this tax ultimately does is it grants Illinois politicians new taxing powers. The constitutional amendment that's on the ballot does not. The flat tax, actually, the Constitution prevented government from introducing multiple layers of taxation, prevented this possibility of a retirement tax, all right, a tax on retirement income, and basically the constitutional amendment that's on the ballot would actually strike that clause out of the Constitution, which actually, face value, it gives the government more new taxing powers. It gives the government the ability, if they choose to do so, to introduce multiple layers of taxation and even a tax on retirement income. In fact, we heard, this is all over the news now, we heard a proponent of the progressive income tax actually go out and mention that in the past, that it's a possibility. It's not off the table. The rates and brackets that have been discussed and even passed in Springfield, should the tax get approved by voters, are subject to change at any time, right? They're not going to write the rates and brackets into the Constitution. And to me, that's a red flag, right? So given the broken promises in Springfield over the years, it's a big red flag to allow Illinois government to have this kind of unlimited power over our income taxes. The progressive tax would directly affect more than 100,000 small businesses. This comes straight from IRS data. And if these businesses that survived COVID-19, the COVID-19 crisis, we know how much businesses have struggled through this horrible economic event. If these businesses are affected, well, it will prevent the rehiring of some workers and, of course, harm the economic recovery. And then lastly, another reason why I'm very skeptical about this proposal is the expected revenue is less than 1/3 of the funds needed to close the state's fiscal deficit. So, on one hand, they say, hey, tax hikes are necessary to close the fiscal deficit. And on the other hand, they introduce very low tax rates at the start. They say, hey, 97% of the population is going to get a tax cut. But basically, by saying that and doing so with these introductory rates, they're essentially unable to close the fiscal deficit, which to me means that more tax hikes are coming in the future. So who's getting an income tax hike? The claim is 97% will get a tax cut or pay the same rate that they currently pay. The reality is Illinois has almost $15 billion, is facing $15 billion of budget deficits. And that's not even counting the unpaid bills, right? They owe payments to businesses that rendered services to the state in the past that have not been paid yet. And then also we are facing this constant rise. Every year pension costs are rising because of the structure, because of the way our pension benefits, public sector pension benefits have been structured and written into the Constitution. And so we're failing to keep up with $140 billion in pension debt that we've accumulated. And so that's another big issue for me, right? So going into this, the rates are not going to cover the fiscal deficit, even though they tell us, this progressive income tax is going to fix all of the state's budgetary issues. But on top of that, you got this continued rise in pension costs that basically means that, these tax rates will have to be temporary and that tax hikes are coming, more tax hikes are coming in the future. Again, the amendment will not set brackets and rates in place. It will not do that, which means that basically these rates and brackets are subject to change by a simple majority vote in the Illinois General Assembly. And again, so what else do we? I think I might have skipped one of my slides here. Sorry about that. All right, claim number 2. Most small businesses will see a tax cut and thrive. Like I said, more than 100,000 pass-through businesses that survive COVID-19 will see a tax hike, and their tax burden will go up by as much as 47%. The total tax rate faced by C Corps will also go up by 10%. Right, so we're taxing both types of businesses and making it very difficult for businesses to change. Right, so some businesses might take one of the option to incorporate in order to avoid the higher taxes, depending on which taxes are higher. But again, this 10% increase in taxes faced by corporations means that we'll have the second highest corporate tax rate in the nation. Is the tax code fair? I think we hear that all the time when we watch the ads, right? The tax code is not fair right now. That's what we hear, the current, right? And the truth is the wealthy already pay more than most of us, right? The high-income Illinoisans already pay more than the rest of us, right? And we know that tax hikes double down on failure. We've had many tax hikes in the past, right? In 2011, 2017, and they have not been successful at closing the budget hole. In fact, they resulted in all of the economic troubles that I discussed at the start of this presentation. Yeah, we've had a slower expansion, slower economic recovery than other states in the last decade, specifically because we're less competitive and we keep taking money out of the economy by taxing business creators, which are basically your members, small business owners. And again, in 18 of 32 states with progressive income taxes, the middle income household pays the highest marginal tax rate. So when the governor comes out and says, we're going to make the tax code fair, what he's essentially saying is, we want to replicate what's in those other states, states with a progressive income tax, and nearly all of them, right? More than half of these states tax the middle class at the highest marginal tax rate, and all of them tax retirement income. So that is extremely worrying for small business owners and Illinois households. So here's kind of what a picture of what I was just referring to. The governor will say, hey, the tax code is not fair. The high-income Illinoisans need to pay more. Well, high-income Illinoisans already pay more than the rest of us. And by the way, this doesn't even come, from the Illinois Policy Institute. It comes from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, a left-leaning group, and they recognize that claim by the governor is actually false. And so some people will say, well, we need more revenue, right? We're in the middle of an economic crisis. We need to close the budget hole that we're facing right now. And one, the tax rates and brackets will not raise enough revenue. But on top of that, nothing in the language, again, for this constitutional amendment promises that revenues will actually go to social services and to reduce the property tax burden by sending money to local governments. In fact, it is not possible to reduce property tax rates without addressing the big pension problem that the state is currently facing. And so that is another very worrying thing. So if you look at politicians' priorities in the last 2 decades, they've prioritized pensions over everything else, right? So pension spending in Illinois has increased by more than 500%. Education spending only increased by 21%, and spending on social services and things that actually help the less fortunate, right? When we talk about fairness, have actually decreased over the last 20 years by 32%. And so when we hear Illinois politicians and the governor and these ads that say the tax code is not fair, and then we see these numbers, it leaves us really wondering why they insist on lying to Illinoisans about what they'll do with the funds and where their priorities are. So what will be the economic impact? I think for most business owners, the biggest concern is what it will do to their bottom line. And so we'll go into that a little bit here. So the total corporate income tax will go from 9.5 to 10.49%. I mentioned that before. And then, but again, these rates will not fix the problem. So we expect the rates to continue to increase. Progressive income tax rates for individuals will range from 4.75 to 7.99%. We'll have one of the highest marginal income tax rates in the country. And there are no spending reforms, right? So I mentioned that we're not doing anything about our pension costs that are rising. We're not even thinking about how to tackle our growing debt burdens. And so we're going to continue to spend. Last budget, I think spending increased again at record levels. And so what does that mean? Well, what that means is without spending reforms, tax rates are going to continue to increase. It also means less money in families' pockets, less money for savings and investment, less money for business owners to reinvest and put into their businesses. And so when you take money out of the economy, you decrease what economists call aggregate demand. And if you do that, then you have a smaller economy, business profits decrease, and we spend less, our living conditions worsen instead of improve. And so that's kind of what we're facing if this progressive income tax is adopted in November. And just kind of give you some numbers to go along with these, with the what I mentioned, right? The fact that we have so much debt and unpaid bills in the books means that well, what are the real rates, right? What are the rates that would actually fix that would actually close these gaps immediately, but are likely to cause a lot of pain for Illinois households? Well, this picture, this table kind of provides that picture for you. If we hold the preferred progressivity of the tax code that the governor and the Illinois General Assembly proposed, then low-income families could face up to if we decided to go ahead and pay the unpaid bills today, an 8% tax rate, marginal tax rate, and that would go all the way up to 13.5% for high-income households. And I just think that is not only is it unacceptable because it will cause a lot of pain, but on top of that, we're in the middle of the worst recession since the Great Depression, and really what we need to be doing right now is to support families, support businesses, and help them recover, not tax them more because we're worried about the budget, and we've made bad decisions in the past that got us in this place that got us where we are in the first place. So in terms of impact, if we're going to try to raise money to close the fiscal gap, the current budget deficit, that could shrink our economy by about $3.1 billion per year. And the drag on the job recovery would be an estimated 28 to 56,000 fewer full-time jobs. And in Bloomington in particular, our estimates are roughly 800 jobs would not return after the COVID-19 already wiped out 6,800 jobs in the last six months. So again, the expected impact is disastrous, and unfortunately, it seems as though the state has not learned its lessons from the past, and is continuing to raise taxes, is staying with the same strategy, the same failed strategy that it's implemented in the past. So what happened in the last state to implement a progressive income tax, right? So one of the things we did at Illinois Policy is we did some research, and we said, okay, well, let's look at what happened in these other states that have actually done the same thing. And the most obvious example is the example of the state of Connecticut, that was the last state 30 years ago. It's the last state to actually go from a flat income tax to a progressive income tax. So it provided a great experiment, a perfect natural experiment to see what actually would happen if we did the same thing here in Illinois. So the first thing is the tax cuts on the middle class were very temporary. And you can see the tax hike, the progressive income tax was implemented in 1996. And you can see that by 1999, tax rates on the median income family began to increase, right? And I think they increased 6 times since the tax was implemented. There's a great article in the Wall Street Journal that just documented this recently. I think came out a couple of days ago. The tax rates actually increased over and over, time and time again, for the median income Connecticut household. And today, well, in 2017, their tax rates had increased by 13%, which again is likely a sign to come when you don't fix the real problems, which are basically our ballooning pension debt that's causing our pension costs to continue to increase. If we adopt the same strategy, right, of raising taxes every time, time and time again, with the intention to fix a budget shortfall, a huge shortfall, well, we can expect our taxes to continue to increase. even for middle-income Illinoisans. In my opinion, that would be really unfair. So what did we see in Connecticut? In Connecticut, we saw the increase in the tax rate for middle-income families within only a couple of years of the tax being implemented. Employment fell relative to similar nearby states. Labor force participation declined, so there were fewer people available to businesses to hire because basically people left the state of Connecticut, and poverty rates increased. And that's really, really shocking, given that in the mid-1990s, we were experiencing an unprecedented economic boom across the country. So Connecticut paid a heavy price for its tax reforms of the 1990s. Last but not least, housing prices appreciated by 46% less than comparable states. States like Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Jersey, that are right next to Connecticut. Again, why are housing prices so important? Well, when housing prices rise, homeowners feel wealthier, and so they spend more. And so an increase in housing prices has a positive effect on economic growth. And so when we see housing appreciation struggle, it's usually a sign that the economy is not doing well and that homeowners are worried about the future. So what are the labor market effects? What do we expect as business owners when we go out and when we face higher taxes? What do workers should expect to see, potential workers should expect to see in the labor market? Well, higher income taxes reduce risk taking, right? So if I'm a business owner and I know that creating an additional job is going to cost me more because basically I'm going to create more output, I'm going to create more widgets, and I'm going to increase, my income is going to increase, then of course you're not going to create that extra job, right? You're not going to take additional risk. And what it means is basically larger firms will benefit from less competition because smaller firms will grow less, right? If smaller firms grow less, they create less competition for bigger businesses, and resulting in higher inequality, not less. And so when we talk about, fairness, a policy that increases inequality is a bad policy and goes completely against the rhetoric that we're hearing in these ads today. Again, lower business profits reduce the benefit from creating an additional job. And that just means higher unemployment for workers. It means less bargaining power for workers and lower wages. In fact, there's a ton of research that shows that when you increase marginal tax rates for entrepreneurs and small business owners, they grow less, they employ fewer people, and they pay their workers less than they would have had they not faced higher taxes. In Connecticut, of course, the last state to enact similar reforms, we saw exactly that, right? So the empirical evidence was very much consistent with all of the economic theory and the research that had been done in the past. What did we see in the housing market? When the housing market, housing costs increase, right? So higher income taxes make housing more expensive in Illinois relative to other states, relative to Indiana, Wisconsin, Iowa. And in fact, the Harvard Center of Housing Study found that the income tax hikes of 2011 worsened a long-term decline in housing prices. And it's kind of disastrous. We saw housing prices fall dramatically during the crisis, the housing crisis. And what would have been a good policy would have been to lower taxes in order to see a quick rebound in housing prices because it helps the economy. And remember how when homeowners are wealthier, they spend more. That stimulates the economy. But instead, in Illinois, we saw the lowest housing appreciation of any state during the last that 10-year economic expansion that we had, and some of that was due to the 2011 income tax hikes. The progressive income tax would likely cause housing prices to grow by 1.5 to 4.9% less. So research shows that housing wealth is extremely important because it helps spending and it helps stimulate economic activity. Again, the Connecticut example, a great example to see what happens when you raise taxes and in the way that the governor is trying to raise taxes this time around. Housing prices in Connecticut appreciate by 46% less than comparable states during the decade that followed the introduction of a progressive income tax. So what are the we understand the economic implications. What are the political implications of this whole thing? Fiscal policy, if we haven't realized yet, is power. Fiscal policy gives Springfield politicians more power, and what this amendment will do is it will remove the limits on that taxing power that were put into the Constitution. And so I guess my big question is, should we give Springfield politicians more power over private lives? Because that's ultimately what we would do by by striking the clause in the Constitution that protects our flat income tax. The use of fiscal policy is basically government's ability to tax and collect revenues and to spend. And by doing so, they can influence aggregate demand, right, and the level of economic activity. So they can influence how private households choose to spend their money, save, business profits, business investments, job creation, and even the income distribution, right? So it's a noble aim to say we want a fairer system, but unfortunately, what the governor proposed might actually do the opposite of fairness of what he's actually promising it will do. So what does it mean politically, the constitutional protection? It means that it's a limit on government's ability to tax individuals. It's a limit on government's ability to influence private lives. But more so, a friend of mine was kind of looking at this proposal, and we tend to disagree very often as to policy prescriptions. But what he noticed was that it's really easy to say, hey, we're going to raise taxes on only 3% of the population. Because when you do that, ultimately, you're dividing the tax base. And when you do that, it's really easy to get support from 97% of taxpayers, right? And so the Pritzker administration is doing that very well. They're trying to divide to conquer. So it's a much easier task to say, we'll just raise taxes on 1%, on 2% of the population, than it is to raise taxes on everybody else. In fact, what we see in states with a progressive income tax, states that have no constitutional protection, is that tax rates and brackets change even more frequently than in states that have a flat income tax or a constitutional protection on what the legislature can or cannot do with taxes and brackets. So why trust Illinois government? I started with the example of my 4-year-old, and one thing he does all the time is he says, "Daddy, I'll eat my dinner, but I'd like to have ice cream first. So I'll have the dessert first, and then I'll eat the dinner later." And then he ends that sentence with "I promise," right? Because he knows that if I'm supposed to trust that if he promises to do that, that's exactly what he'll do. But unfortunately, right, we expect our kids to keep their promises, but we tolerate our government to break whenever they break their promises. And there's a long list of broken tax promises and corruption in Illinois. And I just kind of compiled a short list here for you. Toll-free in 73. Right, I mentioned that earlier. Politicians promised drivers that tolls would be temporary, but the tolls still remain in place today. Not only do they remain in place today, but gas tax hikes were part of the budget last year. So we have tolls, we have tax hikes, and that hurt low-income family more than high-income individuals. 1989, a temporary income tax hike that was set to expire in 1991, and of course, that tax hike was extended for 2 years at first, and then became permanent. So again, another promise Illinois politicians reneged on, and unfortunately, we saw that time and time again right here in Illinois. Transportation taxes that were supposed to fix broken roads and bridges. Later on, the Transportation for Illinois Coalition learned that the funds had actually been diverted and that not all of the money had gone to fix broken roads and bridges. The 2011 tax hike, more recent, everybody can remember that, right? The General Assembly hacked individual income taxes. It was a record tax increase, like a 67%, I think, tax increase. And they promised that that tax increase would have gone away by now. Unfortunately, they made the tax hike permanent in 2017. Remember this tax hike, the promise was that the rate would fall back to 3.25% by 2025. Now we're going to a progressive income tax with the top marginal rate at 7.99%. I don't know. I mean, if we don't see what's going on right before our eyes, I don't know what will fix the state. We have to come together and realize that it's a ton of broken promises after another, and that we cannot allow Illinois politicians with more taxing power and the ability to continue to lie to us time and time again. So what's this kind of a quick summary and alternative policy solutions that we've proposed at the Illinois Policy Institute? First, we want to stop the progressive income tax, because if you allow them to do this again, well, it will never stop, right? It will never stop. Taxes are going to continue to increase. Costs for taxpayers and businesses will continue to increase. The most important thing is what that means for the economy, right? It means lower personal income growth, right? Weaker demand, lower business profits, fewer jobs for job seekers that are struggling right now because of COVID-19. It also means less competition, less business competition, less competition in the labor market for workers, and higher inequality, right? It leads to a system that's even less fair than it is today. We need to adopt anti-corruption measures. We know corruption is a major problem in Illinois. We're the, I think, second most corrupt state in the country, behind maybe only Louisiana. And so we've proposed restrictions on Illinois' revolving door. You got lawmakers who are lobbyists, right? And at the same time go and vote on issues that they get paid directly to vote on, basically. And so that's terrible. Their ability to go back and forth between Springfield and lobbying. And so they only benefit a select few. They don't benefit the rest of us who are working really hard and paying our bills and paying our taxes. We need to empower the Illinois Legislative Inspector General. We need to make it so that lawmakers don't have the power over what's considered unethical or not. And that's something we're fighting for. And you also have the Speaker of the House, Michael Madigan, who's been in power for a long time, and he's been Speaker for a very long time, and he basically has the power, unlike the power that's given to speakers across in other states. He has the power to decide which bills even get to be heard on the House floor in Illinois. And so bills that don't benefit his interests are never going to get a vote. And I think that's unfortunate because, again, it's only a select few that get to be heard, that get to be heard and that have government work for them, whereas the rest of Illinoisans are basically ignored. Last but not least, I think probably the biggest problem, one of the biggest problems we face in Illinois is this pensions, right? Pension costs rising and taking up almost 1/3 of the state budget means that every time, by the way, those are mandatory, right? Because they're written into the state constitution. Every time we raise taxes and money goes to Springfield, 1/3 of our taxes is basically dedicated to public employee pensions, which means that there's less funds for everything else, less funds for social services, for sending kids to college, for investing in our education, for helping the poor and the less fortunate. And so I think if there was to be any kind of constitutional amendment, it had to be to fix a broken pension system and not to give lawmakers more power over our lives, over our tax, our hard-earned incomes. So the pension reform that we propose at the Illinois Policy Institute is one that would preserve current benefits, all right, accrued by public sector workers, but one that would tie the cost of living adjustment. So they have a 3% cost of living adjustment, and we know the economy is not doing so well. It hasn't done well in a while, and inflation has been below 3% for a long time. So if incomes for the rest of us, taxpayers who finance these things, are not increasing at 3% per year, then where do we get the money to continue to pay these cost of living, these 3% cost of living adjustments? So tying the cost of living adjustment to actual inflation, right, would be an important step towards fixing a broken pension system. And you know, we go into more details, but you know, I'm short on time here, so I'm going to recommend you go to the Illinois Policy Institute website to read more about this, and we can also share the slides at the end of the presentation. And then finally, all we really need is political will, right, to enact these important reforms. You know, what's interesting about this pension proposal is that it was actually introduced in 2013 by Madigan, Culleton, and Quinn, all Democrats. So it's actually it was something they viewed as an important step, an important policy. Rahm Emanuel actually came in favor of pension reform in 2018, and so it's kind of shocking that Governor Pritzker is opposing what would be common sense reform to fix the current climate in Illinois. And again, another thing we really need is the support of organizations like yours, right? Business chambers, media outlets, realtor groups, to go out and strongly oppose the progressive income tax. Because if you don't do that, again, it's more income, more of our tax dollars going to Springfield, which ultimately means that they will not engage in the tough reforms that are necessary to fix the state and to improve our living conditions. And that's it from me. I'm happy to take questions now. And again, if you want to partner with the Illinois Policy in fixing the state, please don't hesitate. Visit our website, and we'll provide all kinds of contact with lawmakers and support to enable you to do that.
Orphe, I want to thank you for your time today. We do have a few questions that have popped up in the chat, and so I wanted to make sure we address those in the remaining couple minutes that we have. So going back a little bit, of the states that tax retirement income, at what level does the taxes start? In your research, have you found that?
So I haven't looked into the rates, but I'm happy to forward that information after this presentation to the group. You know, the idea that the simple fact that it's a possibility that Illinois would end up taxing retirement income, I think is disastrous, and because this was one of the saving grace, right, in the state of Illinois, not taxing retirement income. If you look at the data on retiree migration, what you learn is that retirees go to places that with warm weather and zero income taxes, right? And so if we want to prevent our population to shrink even more than it has, I think squeezing retirees is just not the way to go.
Thank you. The next question that popped up for us is going back in your presentation a little bit where you were looking at the state comparison of middle class. So they are struggling with the third claim. Can you drill down on evidence that supports the current state comparison of what the middle class is paying in tax in comparison to what the upper class / rich are paying in taxes?
Absolutely. So the federal government provides a number of deduction exemptions for low-income families that Illinois doesn't. But ultimately, when you take into account all of the total tax burden, income tax burden faced by households in Illinois, you learn that basically the high-income Illinoisans already pay almost double the income tax of low-income Illinoisans. And what's really interesting about that is, again, most people are, hear that and say, "Whoa, that's not possible. We have the same tax rate." No, we don't, right? So under when you look at things like mortgage interest deductions, state and local taxes that are deducted up to a certain level now under the Trump administration, the standard, the really nice standard deduction that was doubled under the Trump administration, you actually learn that that low-income Illinoisans pay a lot less in income tax than high-income Illinoisans, and basically, and also on top of that, if you look at the share of taxes collected by the state that come from high-income households and compare that to low-income households, you also learn there that the bulk of our taxes are paid by high-income Illinoisans, and so again, the point here is not to defend them. The point here is to say what we need is taxes that work for everyone, right? And especially low-income households. But that will never happen unless we fix a broken pension system, because again and again, taxes will have to increase, especially on job creators, on small businesses and job creators, as we can see by the plan that was proposed by the governor.
Thank you. In that same question, there's a follow-up. So what do proponents of this proposed amendment say the revenue should come from?
So those who propose, I'm sorry, was your question those who oppose or those who propose who support?
What does proponents of this proposed amendment say the revenue should come from?
Yeah, proponents are unanimous, and the rich should pay more, right? So if everybody who supports this tax amendment say, hey, we just need to raise taxes on the rich. If we can just raise taxes on 3% of the population, we'll fix the problem. Again, 67% income tax, record income tax hike in 2011, basically was a tax on everyone, and that didn't fix the problem. What makes us think that a tax on 3% on the 3% will fix the problem? That kind of is kind of shocking that they don't realize that it just doesn't add up, right? So if you want to raise the larger the tax base, the more money you can get out of them, right? If you shrink the tax base, right, to 3%, it makes it very difficult to pay the bills. And so their proposal is, oh, we're just going to tax the rich, the 3%, at much higher rates, expecting there not to have any unintended consequences on the economy and on what's going to happen to low-income families and those who have lost their jobs during the COVID-19 crisis. Which, by the way, the people who lost their jobs during the COVID-19 crisis are mostly low-income families, those who can't work from home, right? The majority are minorities, and now we're seeing that most people who are out of work and even out of the labor force are also women. So there's a large number of individuals who are desperate to get back to work and desperate to get things going again for their families, who are struggling and are hoping to have these jobs come back. But unfortunately, this type of tax hike is going to make it very difficult to recover some of the jobs lost during the COVID-19 crisis.
Thank you. So we have just a few more. So one of our participants today, who is a chamber member, shared some resources from the constitutional change and additional information on top marginal rates. She indicates that she is a supporter of the fair tax and appreciates that this session is being conducted. However, she does have a question for you. So how many states have a constitutional requirement for a flat tax is her first question.
So I haven't checked, and maybe my team has, and I can get that to you. But you know, interesting enough, the constitutional amendment does one thing: it prevents, and the clauses, right? So when you look at the Constitution, what you see is there's actual clause in there that prevents lawmakers from introducing, from taxing individuals, similar individuals at different rates, from introducing multiple layers of income taxes. And I think my point here is that we need that protection, because again, fiscal policy is power. It's power over private lives. It has huge consequences for what we do, how we spend, how we save, how we you know, the future, our future, and the future of our kids. And so why should we give, why trust politicians with this much power? Why should we give them even more power when history shows that they've broken every single promise they've made to us?
Thank you, Orphe. Our next question from her is, when you combine all state and local property, income, sales, tax, etc., what percentage of income do the lowest versus the highest income pay in Illinois?
So here's a stat that I have to answer that question. And when you combine all of the tax, when you take the total tax burden of Illinois households, and you include what the governor promised would be a huge tax cut. He said, hey, 97% are going to see a tax cut under the progressive income tax. When you combine all these things, what you learn is that the middle income families will get a $6, and you heard me right, a $6 tax cut, right? A $6 tax cut in their total tax burden. And the reason for that is because the same governor who's been screaming about fairness, who's been, you know, a strong advocate for fairness, introduced 20 new tax hikes and fees last year in last year's budget. And so, and on top of that, because there have been no reforms to spending, property taxes are going to continue to increase. And by the way, the same governor gave us a promise, right? Back, another broken promise. Back last year when they were trying to sell legislators on this progressive income tax, what they said was, we're going to create a property tax task force in order to focus on how we can reduce the property tax burden. And you know, what happened with the task force is extremely sad. They came back with no recommendations. There was nothing. Nothing came out of the property tax task force that was used to sell politicians, to sell Springfield, or at least those who weren't convinced yet on the progressive income tax. And so property taxes are not going away. The taxes and fees, the tax hikes and fees and new fees that were introduced last year are not going away. And so even with the small tax cut that was promised to low-income households in Illinois, the total tax burden will only fall by about $6. Again, enough to buy yourself a Big Mac, and that's it. So clearly, this is not a policy that we should be supporting. It's not worth giving Springfield more power over our future tax burden.
Thank you, Orphe. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I think we're getting right at the top of the hour, and so I just want to be mindful of everyone's time. We have recorded this session, and I have saved the chat, and so we will be sharing that out with you guys later on. Thank you so much, and if you guys do want to get a hold of Illinois Policy, their contact information Orphe shared with everyone, and we'll be sure to send that out in our follow-up. So thank you all today for joining us, and I appreciate your time. Have a happy Wednesday.
Thank you.